You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hello and welcome to Campus Talks, the podcast in which we seek advice for those working in higher education from those working in higher education. I'm Miranda Prynne, campus editor, and today we are discussing motivation and how to engender it in your students and yourself. Motivation must be a great thing to study because it is something everyone wants to know more about. For most of us, it's largely, let's be honest, in the hope we'll find some magic solution that generates a never-ending supply so that we never need face those days when everything feels like a slog, or indeed do battle with our inner procrastination monster ever again. But for lecturers and other university educators, they also need to find ways to keep hundreds of students interested and engaged for months or even years of study. That's a tough gig. But as with all things, knowledge is power, and there are motivational principles that can help, as we're about to learn. Today, we speak to two academics who research and teach to get their insights and practical advice on boosting and sustaining motivation in the classroom and in your own personal or professional endeavours. First, I talked to Ian Taylor, who is a reader in motivational science at Loughborough University, an associate fellow and chartered psychologist of the British Psychological Society, and the author of a new book published this year, Time Hacks: The Psychology of Time and How to Spend It. We discussed the role of educators in helping students develop intrinsic or better quality motivators for learning, the role of emotions, and, of course, procrastination. My colleague Eliza sat down with Helena Seli, a professor of clinical education and assistant dean of academic programme development at the USC Rossier School of Education at the University of Southern California. Now, with almost 20 years teaching experience, Helena is an expert in educational psychology, including motivation, time management, and the social factors that influence learning. She is also co-author with Myron H. Dembo of Motivation and Learning Strategies for College Success, a focus on self-regulated learning. And in this conversation, Eliza and Helena delve into the factors that drive student motivation. They also look at how self-regulation varies between students and how it can be supported by educators and, perhaps now, by AI tools. Fascinating stuff. But first, over to Ian. Hi Ian, thanks for joining me on Campus Talks.
Hi Miranda, thanks for inviting me.
Now, you've been studying motivation for more than 20 years, having done your PhD on motivation in educational settings. So I just wondered, what motivated you to study motivation?
I was interested in physical education and how to get people who were, interested and engaged in physical education. How could we transfer that motivation sort of post schools? And then slowly over time, sport and PE was de-emphasized, and I got really interested in motivation because it's a hugely complicated area and a really interested area in all walks of life.
Yes, motivation is one of those subjects of universal interest because we're all looking at ways to boost it in ourselves, potentially in those around us, just simply to get stuff done. So, looking at education, specifically higher education, I think for a lot of people teaching, the basic principles of how to motivate students are relatively well known. I mean, there's a lot of talk around you've got to make it interesting and fun enough that it does not require loads and loads of willpower on the part of the students to study your subject. That's easy enough to understand. I'm just interested, given that you do also teach alongside your research, if you can give any pointers on how that can be achieved, especially when most lecturers are faced with cohorts of very diverse students?
Motivation was quite a relatively simpler topic 10, 15 years ago, because education was a simpler world. Whereas now there's quite a few challenges with motivation, one of them being the technological advances, and then there's an ever-increasing obsession with grades. So there's various motivational principles, and how you apply those principles may differ depending on each individual. For example, a generalized principle is that you need to provide value in your teaching to motivate students. But what that value is to each individual student will differ. And you'll end up tearing your hair out if you try to promote 150 different values to 150 different students. What your role is, I think, is to try and get them to discover their own value of the content that you're teaching. So explaining or highlighting to them how the content that you're teaching is relevant for them, or relevant to people that they might know, or relevant to different populations, or how the content that you're teaching might solve a problem. You can't sort of force value onto students, but you can sort of help them discover their own personal value. And another way value comes into the concept is that these technological advances are really easy for students to engage with. So if you've got a lecture in person and you simply record that lecture and it's available on demand for them at home, and there's no difference, then you have no added value for them to come to that lecture. So quite a lot of lecturers and people working in higher education always think about, why aren't students turning up anymore? Well, why would they? If I had an opportunity to sit at home and watch a lecture, or get up, have a shower, go to the lecture theatre and have exactly the same experience, then I would take the first option. And I think it's naive of us to think that that would be any different. So we have to provide added value if we want physical bums on seats.
I mean, it's a very good point. Generally, as humans, it's not just students. We will take the easier option if the outcome, as far as we can see it, is going to be the same. So that added value you refer to, for instance, to get bums on seats, what might that look like?
For example, in my own teaching, if there's a real sort of discursive element that happens in the lecture where you really start talking and discussing and evaluating and debating an idea, the skeleton lecture content is recorded and available online, but there's added value to going to the lecture because you get this discursive element to it. Equally, if you've got a section where peers and students are discussing content within each other, hopefully they'll get added value from that. And typically those types of things don't get recorded. Added value, the easiest way is it enhances that learning, it enhances their understanding of the ideas that you're trying to convey. And sometimes that needs to be highlighted explicitly. You quite often you're giving them added value, but they might not realize it's added value. And so you can be quite explicit if there will be added sections that happen in person that I think will add value to your learning and help you understand the concept. And then it's their choice between, okay, is that added value sufficient for me to put my bum on a seat?
Yeah, interesting. You alluded earlier to the fact that grades and the motivational drive that they provide is a complicating factor in all this. So I wondered if you could expand on that a little and perhaps explain what you see as the different types of motivation, or what you might refer to as different quality motivators.
There's a nightmare phrase for a lot of lecturers that students say, and it's something along the lines of, will we be assessed on this lecture? And so they just want to know whether they need to turn up, and that topic might be an essay question. And that's an example of really poor quality motivation. And it's not really the student's fault. It's probably the culture that we bring them up in and educate them now. one of the early things that I learned in my PhD was motivation isn't a single construct. There's different types of motivation that vary in their quality. Most people know the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic is doing it for the love of it. So, turning up to lectures just because you love the content and are really interested in it. That's intrinsic motivation, and that's typically perceived to be high quality. For example, doing it for personal value, you get why you're there. It might be psychology is my area. So I'm studying psychology because I want to be a psychologist. So it's not necessarily for a reward or a punishment, but you see the value in why you're doing it. And then you've got really poor quality motivations. Doing it for grades is the classic one, because it promotes really superficial learning and only learning the bits that are potentially going to be on the assessment. So we can try and shift students towards the sort of higher end, the better quality end of that continuum. And, I'm not saying that all students need to love and be really interested in the content, but we certainly can promote the value of it. But again, it's got to be a personal value to them.
As part of that, you've talked about the fact it can sometimes be very helpful to be fairly explicit about the value add, depending on the scenario. Given that we are speaking in September, just as students start filing in for a new academic year, how important is the start of the year or the start of a course in setting motivation levels and trying to communicate the value of studying hard? Where do you see that sitting in this puzzle?
The beginning is important and it isn't. So it is important because you need to set expectations, you need to set a structure, you need to have clarity. Okay, so as well as value, a really powerful precursor to good quality motivation is competence. If people feel competent at what they're doing, then they will remain motivated, or they're more likely to remain motivated. And for them to feel competent, they need structure. They need to know how they improve. Okay, so they need to know when their assessments are, what the style of feedback will be. So that beginning phase is really important for that, setting the expectations, setting the boundaries, setting the structure.
So just to jump in there, what you're saying is essentially you need to give students the tools to self-direct, to know what they need to do to achieve what they want. And that has to happen at the start.
Absolutely. That's exactly what I'm saying. On the flip side, typically motivation is of highest quality at the beginning. So you've got a willing crowd there. So it's in that sense, it's not so important because the motivation is there. All the longitudinal studies that I've seen, whether it be over a semester, over an academic year, over a few years in education, in sport, motivation typically declines in quality over that time period. So that's your problem. Your problem is not the motivation at the beginning. And I'd also add on that your problem is not really the motivation at the end, because there might be some assessments at the end, so they'll be engaging with the topic, or they're getting to their goals are coming to fruition near the end. So, but it's that middle bit, it's that decline that you need to try to prevent. I mean, partly there's a natural decline because people get tired, fatigue, it's routine, it's the enthusiasm and the novelty disappears. So a little bit of that is natural. In America, they have a term called the sophomore slump, which is essentially the second year of a 3-year degree, let's say. The first year is novel, exciting. The third year is meaningful and important. It's that middle. You've gone far enough down the tunnel that you can't see the light behind you, but you can't yet see the light in front of you. So that is where you really need to focus on those middle bits, promoting the value, promoting the interest. You might want to put the really interesting topics in the middle, for example. If you're the type that tries to embed fun in your lectures, it's really the middle sections, the middle content that you really want to focus on.
Yeah, so it's like a curve from what you describe. In terms of then keeping motivation up in that middle section and the value that you've got to communicate, Is there a big role or a big link with emotions in all this?
You raise a really interesting sort of motivational principle, I guess, in that one of the major functions of emotions are to motivate. If you boil motivation down to its simplest principle, people will go towards things they enjoy and love and make them feel good, and avoid things that have negative emotions. So, and this is probably really tricky to do for lectures, but if you can give students a positive emotional experience during your sort of lectures and learning, then that will be super powerful. They will come back and they will be engaged. And when I talk about fun and positive experience and stuff, quite often people think that it's got to be funny or humorous, and that will help, but it doesn't have to be. You could just make them feel good in other ways. But yeah, emotional aspects are really important, and they're quite often undermined because people think that emotions are associated with, irrational judgments, irrational behaviors, and they are to some extent, but equally they serve a perfectly normal function in that they motivate.
Actually, now you've laid it out, of course, it makes total sense that emotions are completely intertwined with motivation, because that's, I guess, why in evolutionary terms we're programmed to respond to certain things in certain ways, isn't it?
Exactly.
Now, in terms of the positive feelings, I mean, as you point out, it doesn't have to be fun and jokes. Like being challenged and working through something and finding a solution to something can in itself feel incredibly positive. So I guess from a teaching perspective, that maybe makes things a bit easier. What is the impact of AI on all this?
I suppose where I'm starting from is it's not going to go away. So anyone who's that bans AI or any related tech are going to eventually come to a dead end, I think. So AI and generative AI is here to stay. So rather than seeing it as a problem for motivation, which you could perceive it that way, or you could use generative AI yourself in trying to help motivation. So can you use AI to develop some sort of feedback mechanism or some sort of learning content rather than having to read a research paper? Can you provide it in a different format? So I think lecturers and people in higher education need to start thinking of it as an opportunity.
I mean, it occurs to me, talking about Gen AI in this context, you'd describe the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation earlier, and the fact that what educators need to be working towards is building the intrinsic motivation associated with their courses for students. In a perfect world where they've done that brilliantly, then students won't want to use Gen AI for the wrong reasons, because they'll want to use it to learn rather than to avoid learning.
Exactly.
Are there any pedagogical or course design tricks that you would point to that you do feel really boost motivation?
There's real big problems with over-assessment, but I think we could build in signals of their understanding throughout. And maybe generative AI is a solution, or some other technology is a solution there. As I said before, competence is a really sort of powerful precursor of motivation. If you're feeling competent at something, you're halfway there to sort of sustaining it in the long term. And so, can we use technology to give them more indicators that they do understand and they're learning? That would be a pretty good starting point. And be more explicit about the value of the module. If you can't demonstrate a really meaningful value for your module, then why are we teaching it to students?
That makes sense, what you're describing. If I translate it out of an education setting, that competence you refer to and being able to track your improvements or your understanding, I mean, charting progress. There's a reason that we're all addicted to, I don't know, exercise apps that show us how fast we ran X amount of distance compared to 2 weeks ago, or, these things where you can chart your progress in any walk of life. What you're describing is almost like an educational version of that.
Absolutely. And while you were talking there, I couldn't help thinking about Duolingo,
Yeah.
the language app, and your progression cannot be clearer. It's even tied to official sort of criteria of language learning and things like that. So, and I'm not saying we should copy Duolingo, but learning about the principles that they use would be pretty useful endeavor, I think.
Now, let's turn to your recent book, Time Hacks. This is, as the name suggests, very much focused on how we can all optimize our use of our time. And I think anyone will be keen to learn more on this subject. So just to provide a broad outline, what role does time and our perception of it play in motivation?
Time's fundamental to loads of motivational processes. For example, our motivation is really, really flaky in that if I ask you, and I'm going to dip outside of education settings, if I ask you, will you be healthy next week? Will you go to the gym? Everyone looks ahead and sees an ideal version of themselves. So yeah, of course I'll be healthy. Of course I'll exercise next week. But then when you come to that moment, your motivational and emotional states are completely different. And so if you look well into the future, you're motivated about really virtuous, healthy, noble reasons. Whereas in the immediate term, you're motivated by satisfying basic needs for rest, to relieve stress, to eat, and so forth. Another one is willpower. Typically, willpower declines over the course of the day. So thinking that you're going to rely on willpower if you finish I've got a 6 o'clock lecture this semester, 4 till 6 p.m. So, if I think I'm going to rely on my willpower to go to the gym after my 6 p.m. lecture, then I'm sadly mistaken, I think. So willpower declines over time. Motivational inertia, it's the effort to start a task is much greater than to continue it.
Motivational inertia sounds like the smarter sibling of procrastination. I'm sure I speak for many listeners when I self-identify as a procrastinator. I would say this has improved immensely with age, but I think virtually everyone has a bit of procrastinating in them. So, what advice can you offer to all those listening on how to break out of this feast or famine approach to time?
We all know what goal setting is, and the general consensus is that you should set challenging goals. But I think for procrastination especially, the goal is probably too big. So you need to make tiny, tiny, tiny goals. For example, I'll give a student example that you've got an essay to do, and you've been given your essay and the deadline's in 11 weeks to time or whatever. And if your mind is thinking about that essay, that's a huge goal. And some people will think, okay, so you've got to break it down. Okay, yes, you have got to break it down. So you break it down to, okay, well, it's 1,500 words. I'll write 100 words. But what I'm arguing is that goal of 100 words is still too big. You have to include all the pre-tasks that need to be done before starting those 100 words. So your goal should be to open the laptop, nothing more. And then once you've opened the laptop, you've overcome that motivational inertia. So it's much easier now to start thinking, okay, well, actually, the laptop's there. Let's start scribbling or, typing 100 words. So for procrastinators out there, set really, really tiny goals. And the same for, I'm going to give an exercise example. Going for a jog. Let's say if you're aiming to do a 5K park run, and so your goal is 1 kilometer. That 1 kilometer is still way, 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 way too big. So you need to focus all your motivational efforts on putting your trainers on, and then you need to focus all your motivational efforts on getting out the door. And once you've got out the door, you're probably going to go for a jog. And so it's tricking your mind into what the task is, and trying to sort of break it down into really, really tiny chunks that just get the ball going. And once it's going, it becomes a lot easier to complete the actual goal, the 100 words, the 1 kilometer run or whatever.
That's great advice. And I have to say, it really chimes because I actually play a kind of mind trick on myself to get myself running, which I do enjoy hugely. But sometimes, as we all know, the motivational inertia that you refer to, or laziness, might be taking over. And I play a mind game where I just say, just go out and run. You can run for like a minute. And if you want to stop, just stop. And of course, you inevitably actually carry on.
Perfect
So,
micro.
what changes have you made to your daily schedule since researching and writing this book? Since you talk about how motivation wanes throughout the day, have you tweaked the way you go about your work and life?
Yeah, because I sort of learned a lot when I was writing the book. One of the things that I was researching anyway was doing important things earlier in the day. I talked about before willpower declining over the day. It's not just that. It's when humans are not very good at predicting how we're going to feel later, whenever later is. So getting things done earlier in the day. And then I want to emphasize the sort of personally important things as well, things that nourish your soul. Do them first and do them early, because if they're not urgent, let's say, but they're personally important, if you leave them to get there, your work commitments, which are urgent, your family commitments, which are urgent, and your obligations will overtake them, and you won't have the time or energy to do those nourishing activities. Certainly when you're starting something new, a new hobby, for example, do them as early as you possibly can. I think I've really taken that on board. Another one is solitude. Spending time in solitude is a good one. And in the book, I talk about how terrifying solitude is for some people. But if you can overcome that terror, then spending a bit of time in solitude really has some good benefits, some good motivational benefits, and you start to naturally plan and get creative. So I try to get some solitude where I can. So there's lots of other little differences. The micro goals one, I use a lot more now, certainly for the writing the book. When I dreaded having to write some of the book, just getting the laptop open was a good way to overcome that.
Your point that you should do the things that really nourish you first and early, I think for a lot of people in academia whose time is extraordinarily stretched, often with their professional duties, that's a fantastically pertinent piece of advice that, get those things that don't seem urgent in a way done first, because the things that are urgent you will get done later. Well, look, Ian, there's loads of fantastic takeaways there for anyone, both in higher education and indeed elsewhere. So thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thanks for having me. Really enjoyed it.
As I said at the end of that conversation, there are so many useful, practical pointers to take away there. But the one that really sticks with me was Ian's point that one must do the most important tasks first, but these are not necessarily the most urgent. And that was interesting because it seems to fly in the face of how most of us manage our time, which is, of course, to prioritise the most urgent tasks. His advice on breaking work or tasks down into tiny micro goals really mirrors advice that you'll also hear from our next guest, Helena Seli, who again is a rich source of insight on this topic. So let's hear more.
Helena, welcome to the Campus Talks podcast.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Theories and science behind motivation have long informed your work as a professor of clinical education. When I think about motivation, it seems like such a familiar term, but actually it's quite complicated, bringing in things like self-regulation, confidence, individual drivers, whether that's reward or consequence. But let's start with some foundations. Speaking about college students, how do the internal and external factors that affect them drive their motivation to learn?
Absolutely, yes. So when we think about internal factors, we definitely think about things like personal interests, their goals, their reasons for doing things, which we call task value, as well as their confidence and their intrinsic values. So also values such as, sustainability, financial stability, respect for diversity or whatnot. But the external factors then are the grades, the expectations of their parents or their caregivers, as well as social recognition and pay, right? Ultimately, how rewarding is this career, not in terms of intrinsic or internal factors, but also the external contributors such as pay and prestige, etc. So we know that external factors are strong, motivators of extrinsic motivation, which are very effective short term because they really spur you to take action, etc. But really, in order for students to carry them on long term, they have to become internalized, or ideally, I should say, they become internalized. Because if one is impacted solely by external factors, the interest may erode over time. We know that students who are primarily driven by internal factors, again, primarily, not solely, but primarily driven by internal factors, are much more likely during their college years to engage in what we call meaningful learning versus rote learning. And we know that meaningful learning really contributes to encoding much more effectively into long-term memory, and through that, really supporting learning long-term.
In your textbook, so Motivations and Strategies for College Success, there is quite a bit of discussion of self-regulation. What is the relationship between self-regulation and achievement and success through higher education?
Self-regulation is critical. Self-regulation is really sort of the planning, the monitoring, and the evaluation of learning. So from soup to nuts, so to speak, how do you approach learning? How do you engage in learning while you're learning? And then how do you look back at what you've learned? And we know that self-regulation is strongly correlated with academic achievement. Self-regulation includes things such as goal setting, time management, ability to combat procrastination tendencies, and very critically, the concept of metacognition, or what we call thinking about thinking. So constantly sort of being aware and fully awake, if you please, and fully engaged in the learning process, rather than sort of passive learning where your thoughts are often somewhere else and you think you're engaged in learning, but you're really not. So again, students who set clear goals, use more meaningful learning strategies, as we talked before, and reflect on their outcomes and really say, was my strategic approach appropriate? If my exam is based on recall, as in producing short answers rather than recognition, which is often manifested in sort of multiple choice exams or quizzes, am I studying effectively for the type of test, the assessment that the instructor will use? Because studying for recall versus recognition is different. So if you're not self-regulated, you may use sort of an ineffective learning strategy to prepare for the type of assessment that will happen. And so again, we know that self-regulation helps learners to adapt to the learning needs, to persist through challenges and distractions. And we know how distracting the college environment can be. There's, wonderful opportunities to engage in extracurricular activities. And so self-regulation enables you to sort of prioritize, keep your focus on things that are both important and urgent, and through that, really optimize achievement and performance.
It's just sounding a lot like that self-regulation is what we think of as motivation, actually, that ability to open another book, answer another question, go and seek some more answers. Is this ability intrinsic, or is it something that can be taught?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's definitely, what we know is there's a developmental trajectory to this. And students, particularly freshmen, as they enter college, they are shifting from a predominantly teacher, caregiver, parent, controlled, if you please, or certainly directed situation to an entirely self-regulated context. So we know that self-regulation is linked to the prefrontal cortex in our brains, which governs our planning, our decision-making, and very, very importantly, in the context of self-regulation, impulse control. And we know that it develops gradually through childhood and adolescence, and indeed continues into adulthood, which is right the time where our college students are. So the college period really tests it and also provides opportunities to strengthen sort of the maturation of the prefrontal cortex. There's also some aspects of self-regulation that may be a little bit temperamentally influenced, such as those who tend to be a little bit more perhaps emotionally reactive may have a little bit more difficulty in managing their impulses. But with that said, self-regulation is highly, highly teachable. So instruction in goal setting, time management, just the awareness or the awareness of students of the importance of metacognition, thinking while you're thinking, can significantly improve students' ability to regulate their learning. And let's face it, we all have tendencies to procrastinate. I know I do. But there are strategies to identify why we procrastinate, and also strategies to combat our procrastination tendencies, which I sometimes, have to use on a weekly, if not sometimes on a daily basis when faced with unpleasant or difficult tasks that I'd rather not engage in. I still have to lean into my, okay, what strategy, what do I have in my toolbox to overcome this and self-regulate?
Self-awareness can be such a powerful tool, definitely, and especially when it comes to procrastination. I'm not entirely sure that knowing that I procrastinate makes me so much better at not doing it, but I would like to think so.
Absolutely.
Is there any difference there? And you talked about life stages a bit and intellectual development. The university sector has got a wider range of students, a lot of non-traditional students coming in who might be a bit older, starting their studies. When you're teaching these kinds of strategies, are there different considerations that you need for, say, non-traditional students as for your typical 18-year-old undergrad?
Yes, absolutely. So needless to say, traditional students are typically younger, as you mentioned, and they may struggle with lacking sort of the mature self-regulation strategies as they are straight out of that teacher or parent caregiver regulated environment. So they definitely need sort of a more explicit instruction to set goals for time management, etc. While the non-traditional students usually have stronger life skills already. So this is very manifest in sort of when I teach in an undergraduate program versus in a graduate program, and particularly also the difference between a master's and a doctoral program. So folks in the doctoral program obviously have stronger life skills and purpose. They're there very clearly, for this type of degree, not just sort of I need a degree to become competitive in the marketplace. They have a very clear reason to pursuing the degree. But non-traditional students may face demanding, competing demands, jobs and caregiving that strain that ability to self-regulate. But they bring, again, much greater life experience that can enhance self-regulation in goal setting and persistence. So I think the teaching or the supporting of self-regulation, if you please, at the undergraduate level can be much more explicit in teaching strategies, while with more mature students, it's more of a calling on them to use their existing time management skills to succeed.
Yeah, you have spoken already a little bit about making learning meaningful, and that can be a powerful motivator to learning, and also maturity and self-awareness. What about self-confidence? Does that come into people's ability to learn?
Absolutely. Self-confidence, or as we like to call it in academic parlance, self-efficacy, which is a concept that Albert Bandura introduced. We know that self-confidence is directly linked to our ability to self-regulate, which then in turn is highly predictive of our performance and achievement. So self-efficacy is very task specific. So it's very different from self-worth or self-esteem, which is sort of a more of an overall assessment of how good and worthy I am as an individual. Self-confidence is very, as we call, domain specific, and it influences our effort to engage in tasks, our persistence, and again, our resilience to succeed. So students who believe, bottom line, students who believe in their ability to succeed are much more likely to take on challenges, to set challenging goals rather than sort of easy goals, even in the choice of a major, right? Students with higher self-confidence are much more likely to choose challenging majors, and they're much more likely to recover from the setbacks. So when we think about, for example, students in STEM, particularly women in STEM careers, if they face, some challenges in their first math and physics classes, those who have a higher level of self-confidence are much more likely to recover and persist in them, again, ultimately contributing to a tremendous more sort of amount of diversity in the field. So self-efficacy is no small deal in self-confidence. Academic self-confidence in the particular areas is very, very important.
One of the aspects of less ability to self-regulate or less self-efficacy are bad time management. Getting into some practical, perhaps, advice here, what lies behind poor time management, and are there strategies, asking for a friend, to combat a tendency to put things off?
Absolutely. So when we think about time management and procrastination, the roots, or let's say lack of time management and procrastination, the roots of those two sort of areas are quite different. We look at time management, or poor time management, as a lack of skill, but procrastination very clearly as a lack of will. So procrastination is much more related to motivation than sort of a knowledge of how to do things. So skills related to time management may be things such as, particularly when students come to college, their days are filled with short, brief periods of classes and a lot of free time. And obviously that is all designed for homework. So setting regular study periods, almost like fake classes, like they would, sort of pretend that they're in high school and their 10 to 12 is their class X. So studying regular study periods, freeing themselves from the distractions on the college campus, not studying in their residence hall, but locating quiet areas of study, taking short breaks, so sort of mimicking almost what their high school schedule was like, being specific in identifying how one plans to use their study time, prioritizing tasks, working ahead of your assignments when possible. So I have a list of skills, and obviously nowadays we have tremendous amounts of technology and wonderful apps available to support us in it. Now, you can create a beautiful study schedule for your whole week that is well informed by time management skills, but just not get going. May often say, I'll do it tomorrow. I'll feel more motivated about it. So it's that sort of tendency to unnecessarily delay tasks, with the faulty beliefs that one should only work when one is motivated, and that I'll be more motivated shortly or tomorrow. And so time management is not difficult to teach, but procrastination is tougher to tackle because it often stems from fear of failure or perfectionism, right? Or low confidence, right? Low self-confidence or low self-efficacy, doubting my ability to succeed at this task right now. Those are tough barriers to break through. But there's also lots of strategies to combat those procrastination tendencies. One of my favorite ones, and I often face this when for example, I might get a manuscript back and I see already that there's a lot of comments. And, peer review is not always kind. So there's often sort of comments that are quite biting. And so I tell myself often, I'm only going to do 5 minutes and then I'll do something much more pleasant. And I get going. And it's often the case that 45 minutes later, I'm still at it. And it's not that bad. So always kind of chunking things. And if you're working on a major research paper, chunk it and just get going on, let me just do some preliminary research, or use Perplexity or whatever it is as an AI, as a thought partner, or using AI as a thought partner. How can I chunk it? So because it feels so overwhelming and makes me doubt my ability to do it.
Yes. You also mentioned AI, which it's
Yes.
impossible to have conversations about education these days without speaking about AI. And you mentioned that you yourself use it as a tool for getting out of the gate, for starting off that draft. It seems to me that students are using it to outsource a lot of tasks that we usually associate with learning. So things like taking notes, making summaries, doing that first draft. So this is making me think that there are definitely positives and negatives about AI in education with regards to motivation. Have you seen it having any effect on students' ability to self-regulate and motivate? Is it helping? Is it getting in the way?
There's definitely ways in which AI and all the GPT tools can both support and hinder self-regulation. So as you mentioned, support can be manifested in very, very personalized feedback. In fact, AI may really provide us ways to overcome this sort of the 2 sigma problem that Benjamin Bloom established. Over 50 years ago now, where it was clearly shown that students who benefited from tutoring performed, 2 standard deviations above those who were receiving instruction in a group setting. And this has been a vexing problem in education for a long time, sort of one of those wicked problems that we know that we can't provide tutoring for all. It's just impossible, costly, and not enough tutors around. But AI really provides that opportunity to benefit from very personalized feedback, the sort of the scaffolding, and then planning tools that can clearly enhance sort of strategy use as well as metacognition. So there's definitely tremendous benefits. Some of the hindrance is that it can become a way to over rely on AI that can reduce effort, critical thinking, and independent learning if AI is not used mindfully. And a wonderful idea that MIT, researchers at MIT have coined is cognitive debt. So that's not directly related to self-regulation, but it sort of ultimately contributes to self-regulation because it has to do with the sort of the learning and the deep learning that students engage in. So cognitive debt, which is a wonderful term, it's so rich and so important. It captures the idea that offloading thinking to AI provides immediate gains. So producing summaries, right? Taking notes, producing summaries, and obviously yield immediate gains with speed and convenience, but at a very significant deferred cost, ergo the term debt. It contributes to lack of domain understanding in depth because students haven't struggled with it. And we know that learning doesn't come from ease. Learning comes from investing mental effort and that work that our prefrontal cortex does. And that's often hard, if not painful, right? We all know those instances when we're learning and it almost hurts. But when we look back, we learned a great deal. Well, AI can sort of be a shortcut through them, but through that undermined domain understanding, ability to think deeply, and ultimately retention, and really encoding in our long-term memory, so that when we need that knowledge to move, if you please, on Bloom's taxonomy from sort of remembering and understanding things at a lower level to applying, to analyzing, to evaluating situations, and to create new knowledge, we have a wobbly foundation if we've used AI too much, and if we've override on AI. So it's, again, the erosion of mental effort, retention, and ability to think deeply is very significant, and sort of is encapsulated in that idea of the cognitive depth. So it's critical in how AI is integrated into learning, or how students integrate AI into learning, to supplement it rather than as a substitute for cognitive effort, which is critical in learning.
Learning is such an interesting sensation. As you say, it can be so incredibly frustrating, but the feeling of having learned something and that feeling of mastery is incredibly satisfying. I've got one more question. I did wonder how much influence educators can actually have over this. We've talked a lot about intrinsic motivation and self-regulation, and there is a sense that these things can be taught. But at the end of the day, how much influence can you actually exert over your students' motivation to learn?
Huge amount of influence. Educators have a very, very educators, so teachers, faculty, instructors have a significant influence. We know that an enthusiastic instructor's enthusiasm for the subject is one of the main predictors of what we call situational interest. So a student who has never been in a physics class, or oceanography class, or an English literature history, you name it, an enthusiastic professor can bring about situational interest in the moment, in the context of the course, that can over time absolutely develop into individual sustained interest. And so we can show that enthusiasm by our shared levels of energy, connecting the content to students' lives. We can provide students autonomy for their final projects, perhaps adjusting or contextualizing it for their individual lived experiences or their current interests, and also offer constructive and supporting feedback, because we also know that without feedback, learning is not really optimized. So all of that can ignite interest and increase effort. So educators shape the students' perceived value for what they're learning, their confidence, absolutely, giving clear guidance, constructive feedback, and having that sort of mindset that everybody can learn this. It's not that you're the ability, the IQ, the intelligence, but it's really the effort, the self-regulation that we invest in learning that produces the outcome. So everybody can learn this. And then also a classroom climate that, really recognizes the different lived experiences, creating a learning community among the students where supportive relationships can take place. So the instructor-learner relationship is critical in fostering, motivation, engagement, and ultimately, again, what we've been talking about, self-regulation.
Well, thank you very much for bringing us around to the classroom environment as well, and the importance of community, which is a huge part of the university experience, not just the learning experience. Helena, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
You're so welcome. This was so much fun and so important.
Such a rich conversation, again, packed with useful advice. And while the two discussions covered a lot of different ground, I was struck by the number of similarities, even on complex issues such as how AI, if used cleverly, could help sustain student motivation. Both Ian and Helena placed a lot of emphasis on the need for students to find or recognise value in what they are learning. And if there is a core message for university tutors, I think that's it, that you need to help your students find their own personal value from your teaching if they are going to stay motivated. If you'd like more insight and advice on the not-so-simple task of keeping motivation levels high throughout your course, do head to campus, where our latest Spotlight guide brings together loads of resources on this topic. You'll find all of that at www.timeshighereducation.com/campus. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like and subscribe, and we'll be back with you in a couple of weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.